The snow had been falling since before dawn, thick and merciless, turning the frontier town into a silent grave of white where sound felt, swallowed and time slowed to a crawl. And in the middle of that frozen street she pushed a small wooden cart with hands, already numb beyond pain, her breath shallow, each step heavier than the last, the wheels groaning as if even the cart questioned her will to continue. And inside it sat her, child wrapped in a worn patchwork quilt that had once been colorful but was now faded by years of struggle, his cheeks red from the cold, his small body trembling despite her careful tucking, and she bent low to shield him from the wind, whispering words she hoped sounded brave, enough to convince him the world was not ending today, when the sound of boots approached from behind, steady, confident, out of rhythm with desperation, and when she turned, she saw him standing there, tall, broad, carved by hardship rather than privilege, holding a thick fur coat folded over his arm, the kind of coat that meant warmth, safety, survival, and his eyes moved not with judgment but with awareness, taking in the thin fabric of her dress, the exhaustion carved into her face, the way she instinctively placed herself between him and her child, and without a word he extended the coat. Not dramatically, not forcefully, just an offering shaped like decency. But the moment stretched too long, and something hardened in her expression, a wall built from memory and loss, and she shook her head slowly, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the storm. "I don't need pity." And the words carried weight far heavier than snow, because they were not spoken in anger but in refusal to be owned by kindness that demanded surrender, and he felt them land somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere he had kept closed for years, and though he could have insisted, could have argued reason or morality, he didn't, because he saw then that accepting the coat would cost her more than the cold ever could, and so he lowered it, stepping aside as she pulled the cart past him, her steps unsteady but deliberate, her gaze forward, never looking back, and he stood there long after she disappeared between the wooden buildings, snow collecting on his shoulders, realizing that something about her refusal had unsettled him more deeply than gratitude ever could, because strength like hers did not ask to be noticed. It endured, and that night, as the town shut itself behind locked doors and dim lanterns, he could not forget the image of her bent form against the white street, the way she shielded her child with her body, the way pride and desperation coexisted without apology, and he wondered when the world had taught people like her that survival required isolation. And if you're listening to this story right now, if this moment has already wrapped itself around your chest, then you understand why stories like this matter, why they deserve to be followed to the end, and why subscribing is not just support, but a promise to never look away from quiet strength again. The next morning arrived colder than the last, the sky pale and indifferent, and when he stepped outside, the first thing he noticed were the half-buried tracks in the snow, faint but persistent, the mark of a cart pulled not by ease but by determination. And without fully deciding to, he followed them to the edge of town, where the buildings thinned and hope seemed to evaporate, until he reached a broken shack barely standing against the wind, smoke leaking weakly from a crooked chimney, and inside he found what the storm had tried to claim, the child lying still beneath the quilt, coughing softly, her hands shaking as she struggled to coax a fire from damp wood. And when she saw him, fear flickered instantly before pride rose again, and she stood between him and her son even as her knees trembled, ready to defend with nothing but resolve. And this time he didn't offer the coat, didn't speak of help or rescue. He only said quietly that he hadn't come out of obligation or guilt, but because he couldn't forget her. And something in her face softened, not weakness, but exhaustion finally allowed to exist, and the story she had kept locked inside spilled out in fragments. A husband lost to winter, promises broken by towns that feared burden, kindness that always arrived with expectations, and as she spoke, he listened without interrupting, without fixing, without claiming ownership of her pain, and when he placed the coat beside the fire instead of into her hands, she hesitated, then pulled it around her child instead, tears falling silently, and in that moment respect took root where pity never could, and days passed as the storm raged, and they worked side by side, sharing food, warmth, silence, learning that partnership did not require debt, only presence. And when spring finally thawed the town, people whispered not about a man who gave a coat, but about a woman who refused one and still survived, and about the man who fell not because she needed saving, but because she never asked to be saved. And if this story stayed with you, if it lingered longer than most, then you already know why this channel exists. Because some stories don't just entertain, they remind us who we are. And subscribing is how you make sure you never miss another one that does exactly that.